So a very good morning, good afternoon, good evening. I'm not sure where you're all calling from, but really delighted to have you on this short negotiation session this morning. Let me briefly introduce ourselves. My name is Paul Fisher. I'm the Programme Director of the Oxford Programme on Negotiation. I'm an Associate Fellow at Surrey Business School, and I essentially run our two one-week programmes we hold every year where people from around the world come to Oxford to learn the art and science of negotiation. This is my colleague, Professor Owen Derbyshire. Owen, do you want to say a couple of words before we get going?
Yes, well, welcome to this webinar from Oxford. As you can see, I'm Owen Derbyshire. I'm an academic, a professor at Oxford, where I've been for some, over 25 years, just let's say that. Connects both with the Surrey Business School and Pembroke College, and I oversee the negotiation programs within the school, as well as researching and doing both executive education and consulting in negotiations.
Great, thank you very much, Owen. So what I want to do to start with, just to get you in that kind of negotiation frame of mind, is and keep you on your toes. I've got a couple of questions which Gary is going to couple of polls which Gary is going to put to you. And my first question is, how often do you negotiate? How often do you negotiate? Is it only occasionally, every month, every week, or every day? And perhaps you could put in the chat some of the typical negotiations you tend to be involved in. So how often you negotiate? I see Louisa has immediately said daily, and feel free, Gary. I think we've already got 115 responses, so feel free to share the results now. And the majority is every day, and really that is, life is a negotiation. Absolutely, Matthew. We do negotiate all the time. We negotiate, there's lots of different levels of negotiation. So we have the large scale negotiations, the mergers and acquisitions between companies, the treaties, the trade agreements, the EU and the UK, Trump and North Korea. Of course, one of the most important negotiations going on in the world today is around climate change, incredibly complex, multi-issue, multi-party negotiations. And of course, sometime, God willing, at some stage in the next few years, hopefully we'll get a negotiated agreement to the terrible war in Ukraine. So we have those big high-profile negotiations, and then of course we have those negotiations which tend to take place which on a sort of more of a sort of regular basis. So anyone who's got children, you're negotiating with your children a lot of the time. I think it's a mixture probably of negotiation and a bit of coercion as well. I've got a 17-year-old daughter, and I thought it was tough negotiating with her when she was 4, but it doesn't actually get much easier as you go along. And you negotiate, you buy houses, you buy and sell cars, and then of course you negotiate at work. So individually, you negotiate on behalf of yourself in terms of jobs, salaries, performance reviews, flexible working. And then, of course, you negotiate on behalf of your organization, joint ventures, internal negotiations, allocating resources. So negotiation is absolutely crucial to much of what we do. So I've got a second question I'm going to ask you, and that is, how much do you actually enjoy negotiating? So do you love it? Do you love the sort of the competitive elements, going in a room, going back and forth, or do you find it a bit of an ordeal? Do you kind of break into a cold sweat at the thought of having to negotiate? So that's the second question, if you wouldn't mind sharing on the screen, Gary. And I'm sorry, Sharon, I'm going to ask you, I know you've got your hands raised, but would you mind sort of waiting until the end? Just because we have a lot of people on the call, and I think if I start listening to everybody at this stage, I want to make this interactive, but I think if you could part your question or whatever you've got in mind, that would be great, and we'll come to it in a minute. Again, Gary, feel free to share the results. And the reason I asked this question about whether you enjoy negotiating is quite often people, and there's often a gender dimension to this, tend to shy away from negotiations. They find it too adversarial. It tends to impact relationships. And I think one of the objectives of this session, and I can see actually only 20% actually really enjoy negotiating, and a good chunk, are kind of in the middle. But one of the objectives of this session, and certainly of our whole one-week program, is to argue against this approach and characterization of negotiation as adversarial and competitive. It doesn't have to be that way. It can be collaborative. And also, if we can give you greater confidence in your negotiations, you tend to be more effective as well. Anxious negotiators, nervous negotiators don't tend to be very good negotiators. They break into a cold sweat. They start giving away things really quickly, and they just want the whole ordeal to be over. So if I could define negotiation and what we'd like you to take away from this session, and actually the whole 1 week program as well, it would be firstly to give you greater confidence in negotiation, and secondly, to get to focus on the collaborative elements. And we're going to talk a little bit about that today as well. So based on that, if I could give a definition of negotiation, it would essentially be this. It's a back and forth communication designed to reach an agreement where you and the other side have some interests that are shared and others that are opposed. I think one of my favorite definitions of negotiation was by a 19th century French diplomat who described negotiation diplomacy as the art of letting the other side have your way, the art of letting the other side have your way. Or to put it another way, it really asks and addresses the question that I can guarantee all of you face in pretty much every day and every interaction of your life. How might we engage with others in a way that yields better outcomes and understanding? So based on this, what Owen and I are going to do in the next sort of 20 minutes or so is look at 4 dimensions to negotiation, which are also key elements of our Oxford Programme on negotiation. And they're the following. Firstly, claim. We're going to look at how you claim value in a negotiation. But of course, that is quite a limited definition of negotiation. So we're also going to look at how you create value, which is really central to our focus and our teaching office. How not only you claim value, but you actually have to create value as well. Then we're going to look at the importance of process to help structure negotiations. And then finally, Owen is going to look at multi-party, multi-issues negotiations, some of those sort of really challenging, messy negotiations that we tend to have. By the way, Gary, you can take the poll down now. And not only are we going to give you some practical tools about this, but we're also hopefully going to give you a little bit of flavour about what to expect if you wanted to come on the longer programme. Obviously, it's a bit of a challenge condensing a week's teaching into 30 minutes, but I hope you'll find these useful in terms of giving you taste as the fascinating subject of negotiation. So claiming in negotiations. One of the most common perspectives in negotiation is that it's about claiming value, getting as much as the pie for yourself as possible. Now, in our program, we demonstrate there's actually a lot more to negotiation than this, but it's also important to recognize that there's always going to be an element of claiming value. And it's also important to understand the types of techniques that people use in order to achieve this. So, for example, some people might use the power approach in negotiation. A simple basis of power is coercive power moves, to use threats, bullying, try to push through and try and get your own way. And there's examples of negotiators around the world who take that stance. One famous one being the former President of the United States, Donald Trump. He used that sort of coercive method of negotiation. And this dimension can be used in all types of negotiations. So small negotiations where one party has greater power than the other, right through to those kind of international trade negotiations. And in many commercial negotiations, when you're dealing with counterparts of different sizes, there's often going to be a dimension of power where they're using their power to drive their costs down, drive their profits up at the expense of the counterpart. Have you ever made concessions as a result of these power tactics? Well, yes, you probably have. We do so sometimes because we find these tactics disconcerting. We don't like conflict. We get intimidated. But what I'd encourage you to do as you enter a negotiation is not only look to advance your own power, but also where you are able to display sufficient confidence and what I would call resolve to counter such tactics. And there's also important means of addressing these power tactics, which you can do in a negotiation. I'm going to just very briefly talk about 3 of those: anchoring, generating alternatives, and the power of information. So firstly, anchoring. Now, I'm sure a number of you have come across anchoring, but it's an incredibly powerful psychological phenomenon. It means that you depend heavily on the initial piece of information you make when you make decisions, the initial piece of information. It was Amos Tversky and Daniel Kahneman. Daniel Kahneman is very famous for his very famous book, Thinking Fast and Slow, sort of first documented the anchoring bias. They had a group of students who were playing a Wheel of Fortune game, a roulette wheel, and it was rigged, where the only numbers which came up were 10 and 65. And then the students both groups were asked to estimate the percentage of African nations in the United Nations. And the average estimate for those who saw the 10 come up on the roulette wheel, 25%, and the average estimate for those who saw the 65 was 45%. So it's incredibly powerful. So the fact that people adjust rather than create when making decisions enables you, for example, to make the first offer. That can be really powerful in a negotiation. The second thing I'd say in terms of negotiation is the idea of options and alternatives. The more options and alternatives you have in a negotiation, the more effective you're going to be. So what I'd encourage you when you come to a negotiation is always work on those options. Try and find out as many alternatives you can have. So take, for example, procurement, where you're negotiating with a new supplier. If you've got multiple options, you're inevitably going to be in a better position in the negotiation. The same with if you're negotiating a new salary. If you've got rival options elsewhere, you're going to be much more powerful in the negotiation. But it's also important to realize that in a negotiation, it's important to make sure that your goal isn't to reach an agreement, it's the goal to reach an agreement that's better than your alternatives. And if you don't have alternatives, you're essentially a deal taker rather than a deal maker. So alternatives and options give you that sense of freedom. And the final one is information. The more information you have, the more you will understand what your counterpart is trying to do, and the more powerful you're going to be in the negotiation. And much of what we talk about, listening, questioning, research, is all about getting information. These information gathering skills are crucial. So I've talked about claim. I've talked enough about that. So I'm now going to move over to Owen to talk about the importance of creating value in negotiation. Owen.
Thanks very much, Paul. So Paul's just there been talking about the importance of sort of power and the degrees of coercion that occur. One of the key things to understand about negotiations is that that isn't typically the sole element or the central element that we want to focus on. And instead, there are lots of opportunities in negotiations. Paul, you could take the slide down if you like, that's it. There are lots of opportunities in negotiations to create value for both parties. Now, one of the troubles when people think about negotiations is that typically what they do is that they sort of have in mind something that's about haggling. It's about a power play. It is about trying to win. It's trying to beat the other side, if you like. It's trying to get a better deal than the other person. And that negates the notion that there are multiple solutions to any particular negotiation. Indeed, one of the problems that sometimes with many people is simply using the word negotiation, which people then automatically associate with something which is to do with haggling. And instead of that, what we can do is that we can think about negotiations often as being about problem solving. We've got a problem in front of us. There are multiple issues that we have when we're trying to address that problem. And how is it we can put pieces of a jigsaw together where we're actually going to be able to create more value, not just for one side, actually, but for both. In other words, the outcome isn't itself sort of predetermined. So what are those opportunities to create value? Just let's have a think of a couple of examples. So, firstly, we can think of lots more complicated examples, but I'm just going to pick on one that will be very familiar to everybody, which is thinking about a job negotiation. One dimension of a job negotiation would be to simply to focus on what the salary that you're going to be paid is. But actually, that's just one component of what's going to matter as you're engaged in getting a new job. You could care about the start date, the number of days of holiday a year, how much time you're going to be working at home, what the location is. Sometimes that's going to be country, sometimes it's within a country. What title are you going to be given? When are you going to be given reviews for promotion? What projects are you going to be assigned with? Now, we could carry on that list, quite for quite a long time. the key to creating more value is to try to understand what the opportunities are for you giving away something that is actually of relatively low value to you. It's not something you care deeply about, but in return to get something that is of high value. So of the list of items that I've just presented there, which ones that matter most to you? Is it location? Location for some people is going to be a really critical variable. For others, they're going to be thinking much more long-term about the promotion prospects, and the salary now is relatively less important than those promotion opportunities. What happens in too many negotiations is that people can become fixated on one dimension, and particularly that's often a dimension with a financial component to it. Once we understand that there is these multiple dimensions, it may be that the employer cares more about one or two of these elements and that you care about different elements. So what you're doing is you're searching for which item do you value highly and which item do you not care about so much, just to trade those for those that the other party cares about not so much, or cares about more. And you're trading across these multiple items. We could do exactly the same type of analysis for procurement, and I won't try to bore you with going through a list, but you've got price, quantity, delivery, payment terms, and so on and so on and so on. But what we're trying to do there is we're thinking about the fact that these multiple dimensions are all going to create different value for both sides. So if we just try and think about that just graphically for those who like it, Paul, could you just, if we start with the notion of a distributive negotiation, we've got no deal in the origin, but the type of claiming value that Paul was talking about is you're trying to decide, see who gets what share of the value. Is it A or B? Is it, if you settle at X, then A is getting relatively more of the value. If you settle at Y, then B is getting more of the value. The notion about thinking about creating value is that there may be opportunities not to get stuck on that line, but to create more value for both of you. In other words, to expand the total value that you create. Now, you still have got value that you've got to divide. If you can see that line, you're still having to differentiate whether A gets a different share than B. So power doesn't go away, but you haven't got stuck with the notion that there's just one level of value to create. That's great, Paul, thanks. And then we got to think about what it is that actually is key in order to be able to create value. Well, it's not so much power, but it is about information exchange and learning. You have to learn what matters most to the other side so that you can propose trades. The other side also needs to understand more deeply about you. And so when you enter a negotiation, you might have a series of assumptions, but you've got to engage in a conversation. You've got to engage in problem solving. And if you frame it as problem solving, then it's much more likely that you're going to be able to construct that in a positive way. That said, there is, of course, a caveat, which is that there are risks associated with anything that exchanges information. And so I'm just going to show you graphically how we might think of the dangers that come from information exchange. If we have one party, negotiator A, who just discloses every information. They just tell you the most important thing in my job negotiation is location. It's much more important than anything else because, my partner lives in this city and I really, really need to be there. Of course, that type of exchange, that giving away of full information without having received any information can make you more vulnerable, because the other party can then go, well, look, I will be able to give you that location, but only if you commit to these projects, this start date, this salary, this these work from home conditions, or whatever else it might be. In other words, they may be able to vary the terms of the agreement that you've reached so that they capture, if you like, comparatively more of the pie. what you want to do to get enhanced value for both parties is you both want to exchange information and learn about each other in a relatively even way. So the question then is, how do you go about doing that? Well, typically you go about doing it iteratively or with reciprocity. So you progressively give little bits of information and the other party gives you information back. You give them some more information, they give you more back. So that reciprocal exchange of information allows both parties to learn about the other relatively evenly, and then to share this enhanced value that you have created. So that's a very quick look at value creation, which we explore in much more technical detail, but also in terms of the sort of social dynamics of this, of how you engage in it as an art in a negotiation. Paul, so over to you to think about process.
Thank you very much, Owen. Right, just got a quick question for you here. I'd like to start this sort of third dimension of negotiation by looking at this data. So these are the consent figures for organ donations in European countries. So this is donating organs to medical research or to help other people after your deaths. And these are the percentage of consent figures in these countries. And these are the percentage in a number of other countries. So my question for you is, why is there such a huge difference between, say, Denmark and Germany and Austria and Belgium? What is going on here? Why the discrepancy? And if anyone would like to, Owen, you looking at the chat, or if anyone would like to just take their mic off? Very simple answer. Has anyone got it?
Quite a few have online, Paul.
Oh, very good. I'm sure Joseph, go on, tell me what it is. Go on, take your mic off. Let's hear you. It's essentially, I'm going to answer it. I think most number of you got it. It's essentially opt-in and opt-out. So in Denmark, Germany, and other countries, you have to take a proactive action to opt-in and say, yes, I'd like to donate my organs. And in Austria and Belgium and France, you have to take a proactive action to say, no, I don't want to donate. So this is essentially the power of setting the default. The bottom line is that people are often lazy. We tend to take those kind of mental shortcuts, and we look to other people to signal what we should do in a given situation. And since defaults don't require people to make any effort, they can be really simple, but very, very powerful as well. And if a book, I don't know if anyone's read a book called Nudge by Richard Taylor and Cass Sustein from the University of Chicago, but it talks a lot about the power of setting the default and how it can be really powerful in terms of encouraging people to save, invest in their pensions, etc., etc. But what does it mean in terms of negotiation? Well, the setting of a default in a negotiation can be very powerful when it comes to process, our third principle. So, for example, take two really important structural elements of a negotiation: contracts and agendas. So, for example, if you were in the middle of a negotiation and you said, "I hope you don't mind, but I've taken the liberty of putting together a sort of a draft contract, a framework agreement," your counterpart might sort of take the contract and start putting red lines through it, but they're very, very unlikely to sort of rip it up and start again. So by setting the default and putting forward a framework, a contract, you're actually sort of helping control the process and helping control the negotiation. Another example is the agenda. Now, agenda, a lot of people, when it comes to agendas, sort of see it as a logistic, something which has just got to be done, but it's a really important structural element of a negotiation, and it can be really strategic as well. So, for example, try determining the scope of the agenda. How wide-ranging will the discussions be? What issues do I want to bring to the table? The more you can establish the parameters, the less likely that last-minute unwelcome demands will appear. So the sequencing of issues is also important. What are the priority issues? It tends to be often a reliable rule that the items early on the agenda tend to get more attention than the later items. So you can start thinking about sequencing issues, building momentum, deepening relationships, maybe starting with some of the easier issues so you can build the relationship and the trust based on that, package proposals together. So agendas can be really, really powerful, and they're all part of process. Baroness Ashton, who's one of our speakers on a negotiation program, who led the European Union's foreign policy for 6 years, she talked about how vital process was when she was negotiating the Iran nuclear deal with all the different parties, the US and Russia, when she was negotiating in Ukraine. So process and that idea of agenda can be really, really powerful in a negotiation. And there are few better examples of controlling the process than a negotiation which has taken place quite recently between the UK and the European Union. Many of you, I'm sure, have been sort of following this tortuous process over the last few years, which has now come to an end, although there's many more negotiations going on. This is a picture here of the Europeans. On the left-hand side, Michel Barnier and Sabine Weyand and her team. And on the right, we have the UK negotiators, David Davis and Oliver Robbins. Just a sort of general question, who do you think is probably better prepared for this negotiation? Who's your money on in terms of who's going to take control of the process? Any thoughts? I see Oliver's, yeah, you're right. So Oliver Robbins has got a little yellow post-it note on his side, and the Europeans have got sheafs of paper. I'm sure Richard, you're probably going to say the same answer, sheafs of paper there. And it's a very good example, actually, very sort of symbolic example, really, of how Michel Barnier and the Europeans were really successful in controlling the process. So they essentially created a landing zone for an agreement really early on in the process. So you might remember in UK politics, at the time of the referendum, David Cameron stood down, Theresa May took over, the Conservatives were sort of trying to work out who the next leader was going to be. And Michel Barnier was very clever. Immediately he was speaking to all the European Union heads and putting together a coherent strategy. And what they managed to do is they got all their big issues on the table, the ones which are really important to them, before they were even prepared to talk about the future relationship. So for them, the Northern Ireland Protocol, the divorce agreement in terms of how much money the UK was going to pay for its obligations, and the rights of European citizens. So they got all their issues off the table before the UK could even start leveraging, its negotiating position, obviously being a very sort of important market for Europe. So that's a great example. And actually, Brexit, we owe Boris Johnson and his predecessors a thank you for managing to produce a fantastic case study on how not to negotiate. And I've written a number of articles on that. So that is the process. And I'm now going to hand over to Owen to talk about the final one we're going to talk about today, which is multi-party. Owen, over to you.
Thanks, Paul. So actually, Paul just gave an example of a dimension of multi-party negotiations when he was referring to the fact that Michel Barnier had gone around all of the 27 EU countries, but plus actually Parliament and various others, to try to build up a common position. And different parties played different strengths and roles in that. But that was clearly a multi-party negotiation to come up with what the most important issues were. Paul also mentioned earlier on about, sort of the complexity of climate change negotiations and how messy many of these international and complex negotiations are. Now, that might give you the impression that multi-party negotiations are, confined perhaps to that type of sphere. Actually, one of the characteristics of multi-party negotiations is just how common they are and how often we don't actually realize or think of them as negotiations. In fact, going back to the earlier poll results where people had said that they focus a lot of the time every day on negotiations, I bet you a lot of those are in fact multi-party negotiations, because and often they will be informal negotiations. If you think about those people, when you're at work, you're looking for a new project that you're going to be engaged in. You're looking for a change initiative. You have got a new proposal that you've got in terms of your employment structure. You want some flexibility on it. Or a lot of different things that go on require you to actually meet and discuss and to reach an agreement overall, but where multiple stakeholders, multiple parties are actually involved. So the characteristic of a multi-party negotiation is typically there are lots of issues, yes, but also that there are multiple stakeholders. And what you are then going to need to do is to get the support of different stakeholders to build, if you like, a coalition of support for you to be successful. So if you want to change initiative, how do you get other people on your side to support the idea that this change program is going to be worthwhile, investing the time, the resources and effort in? But also, how do you get enough of a momentum from a group within the organization that can drive this particular change or this particular project forward? So multi-party negotiations become very common. They're also, of course, immensely common. There were quite a few people who referred to their children earlier on and how often they negotiate. Well, families, are often have these dimensions of multi-party negotiations in them as well. If I want to build support to go out to a particular place, one of my children's got a birthday today. If I want to get some support to go out to where I want or where he wants, I'm probably going to have to negotiate with him, try and negotiate with his brothers before we sort of, present that to the rest of the family. In other words, if I can build up a bit of a coalition of support, then I've already got the momentum. You're not just trying to persuade me that I ought to change my mind. You're actually trying to persuade a group of others that they need to change their mind as well. And of course, once you've got that momentum, that's a much, much harder thing to do. So gathering that coalition of support, gathering commitment from other groups of people becomes a central factor. And often, if not frequently, these negotiations take a long time. Paul referred actually to gender earlier, and gender in negotiations is a really fascinating topic. It's one we can explore much further. But one of the features is that negotiations that women typically take, that occur for women at work, are of a slightly different character to those that occur for men. They're often a little bit more around sort of having to bend the rules because rules historically have been centered around a sort of a patriarchal view of employment. And once you start thinking about actually differential conditions that might be more suitable for a more diverse workforce, you get a different pattern of employment relationship that's required, but the rules haven't necessarily adopted towards those. So in order to change or to break those rules or to amend them, there's often a coalition of support that's required. But these can take, actually building up that coalition of support can often take months. In other words, negotiations aren't something where you just sit down at the table and do. They occur over a long period of time. But if you don't think about them systematically as negotiations, then there's likely to be, you're likely to find it harder to achieve them. One very last thing that you have to be aware of in multi-party negotiations is that people play different roles. So you've got people who are actually central to the negotiation. You've got other people who are potentially there in the background as support. You've got others who might be able to be a facilitator. Let me have that conversation and see if I can smooth the wheels and make sure that this runs more smoothly. You've got some people who might be a bit of a blocker, and you've got others who just are a bystander. So there are lots of different roles that are played, and you need to think and understand about those if you're going to be effective in taking the negotiation forward. So just Paul, I don't know if you want just the summary slide on that as I sort of finish. Those are the sort of different types of aspect that one might want to think about with respect to a multi-party negotiation. Often, as I say, they can be informal. Thanks, Paul.
Great, thank you very much, Owen. So there you have it. Essentially, those are the 4 areas we're going to cover. We've covered claim, create, process, and multi-party. And I might add in our negotiation 1-week program, by the end of week, you tend to be doing a lot of multi-party, multi-issue simulations where coalitions of support are really, really important. Now, before I hand over to a couple of our alumni who very kindly agreed to be on the call today, I just want to give you tell you a little bit about the program. So essentially, we think this program is really unique, our Oxford Program on Negotiation. We do a lot of simulations. I think probably about 60% of our time during the week is spent actually negotiating. We're great believers in learning via doing. We have a lot of tutor support, and what every individual who comes on the program has a tutor, and they work with the tutor on their own negotiation challenges, and they get the opportunity to set the agenda. So if they might be doing a difficult M&A at work or another particular challenge, and they'll work on it during the week, and the tutor will be able to offer real-time feedback as they go through the simulation. So we see that's a real value add, and something that a lot of people benefit from. Guest speakers, we have a number of guest speakers coming, negotiation practitioners from different walks of life. In October, we have Sue Williams, one of the world's leading hostage negotiators, talking about some of the challenging negotiations she has, covering everything from negotiating with Somali pirates to negotiating with the Taliban to just negotiating and persuading people that life is worth living. She's quite often involved in suicide interventions. And we also have Jonathan Powell. Jonathan Powell is was the lead negotiator for the Good Friday Agreement. He was Tony Blair's chief of staff, and he spent his years post-government going around the world helping people in their negotiations. He's written a brilliant book called Talking with Terrorists, Negotiating with Terrorists. Peer-to-peer learning, I think that's really important. And maybe Lee or Suzanne might want to pick up on this, but we think that we tend to have such a diverse cohort of people that you tend to learn a huge amount from each other. It's very culturally diverse. Our last program had 21 different countries represented. And while you'll learn a lot from myself and Owen and other faculty, just learning from each other, sharing experiences is a really, really important part of the program. And finally, we have an extensive faculty as well. So that's my little sort of sell in terms of the program, but don't just take our word for it. Have a listen from some of the people who've actually been on the program. So for what I want to do really is just introduce Lee Adams and Suzanne. Lee Adams and Suzanne Han. Lee and Suzanne were on our last program just 4 weeks ago, and they very, very kindly agreed to join us today and just share some of their experiences. I'll only keep this slide up for a second, but Lee is head of commercial at Taylor Rose. He's a practicing lawyer who's now transitioned into a management role, so his focus now is on driving commercial performance. And then Suzanne has a background in international business culture and coaching and mediation. She's a founder of a Paris-based consulting firm called Rias Consulting, focusing on facilitating change and collaboration. So thank you so much to both of you for joining us today. I've just got, and Owen, feel free to chip in. I've just got a sort of general question for both of you, really, but then you're welcome to take the discussion where you want. But it's now a month since the program finished. What reflections have you got? And are you managing to apply what you learned in your day-to-day world? I'll start with Lee, and then we'll move on.
Well, hi, everybody. For a start, it was great. Everything about the course was so high quality. That's the thing that really stuck out for me. So, you know, the speakers were fantastic, but also the opportunity to learn from the rest of the cohort. Like Paul mentioned, you know, being a Brit and one of only 3 Brits on the course was actually fantastic, because it meant that I got to interact and learn from a lot of different types of people from all around the world, from Europe, from America and the Middle East, further afield even. And I'd say one of the most impactful things for me was actually seeing how everybody brought lots of different experience, and everybody was willing to share and learn from each other. There was nobody who was sort of you know, above getting involved in the simulations or sharing their experiences. Everybody was super open. So for me, not only was you know, everything that the course provided really, really high quality, but it was also the people in the course which made a big impact for me as well.
Thanks so much, Lee. Suzanne?
Well, for me, the very outstanding thing this week was that I finished the negotiation, and it has become very easy to negotiate for me. So the preparation is very clear, the process itself is very clear, and I'm looking very much into how to create value for both sides, and that is pretty new to me. And that is maybe the biggest change for me. My role in negotiation has changed with the program, and of course that happened to many different perspectives. But I also see that the concrete application now is pretty easy, and I think that's due to the many simulations we had. And I can also share that not all of them went well. So you learn from the good sides and the things that happen and you have to reflect on afterwards. So it's really a complete experience. And maybe one more outstanding thing for me, and I guess for you too, Lee, that was the group. The faculty, but also the other participants, because we had very strong bonding. We're still in touch today. And that really makes the learning experience so much more appreciable for everyone.
Thank you so much, Suzanne. I've just got one other question. So what I mentioned when we talked about the program, one of the key features is the tutors to give you that kind of real-time feedback, to kind of almost sort of mentor you as you go through the program. How useful did you find that?
Yeah, that was definitely a great extra layer to have. So it was really useful to spend 40–50% of the time learning and listening to these concepts and having lots of examples, and then spending the rest of the time either in simulations, so putting those things into practice, which was super helpful, really the basis of learning and growing in confidence. And it definitely grew my confidence in those situations. But then to have an additional layer where after all of that, we could then go to a one-on-one tutor scenario where we could say to them, well, what if I tried this? What do you think about this concept? Or I've got this other thing going on in my job at the moment. What do you think? It just meant that the whole week was really well utilized. So there really wasn't a moment wasted. And having that peer-to-peer tutor, I think was a great value add for me, and not one that I expected, actually, because I didn't know about that coming onto the course.
Thanks, Lee. Suzanne?
Well, I think the learning experience itself on site is really dense. So I remember we had to already be there on the course, follow, but then a lot of preparation work as well, which is very good to dive deep into the topics. And for me, my tutor helped me to stay focused on the one thing I want to, or the two things I want to focus on during the week, because you can't change everything at once. And this was a very good process that was going on at the same time. So we had a lot of feedback from the tutors, and also some additional viewpoints. And for me, it was very interesting because my tutor was also a mediator and knew this negotiation part, mediations, which somehow completed the experience.
Great. Thank you both very much. I'll just ask you one final question, then we'll go straight into the Q&A, and you're welcome to contribute to that as well. If there was one highlight, one lasting memory, 4 weeks on from the program, what would that be?
I think probably the social aspects. I think all of the things that you will learn, you can probably expect, and you know what to expect with that kind of thing. But the thing that I didn't, that took me by surprise, was how sociable not only the cohort were, but also the lecturers. So we had a couple of nice evenings where we didn't have anything planned as part of the course, but everybody got together anyway, had dinner. There was one memorable night on the rooftop of the hotel we're all staying in, where we got some pizzas in and a few drinks, and everybody joined in. And I think, like Suzanne said, we're very bonded because of that kind of experience. So, the quality of the course, the speakers, the material was all fantastic. But the thing that really surprised me and sticks with me is the social aspect as well.
Fantastic. I think you played a really important role as well in terms of getting all the orders for the pizzas. So good job. Suzanne.
Well, I completely agree with Lee. Maybe to add another viewpoint on this, I really enjoyed having many different perspectives on the topic. So there were many different speakers. Already the faculty was quite big, but also different guest speakers we had, and every one of them added their viewpoint, the experience, and you could just pick from every one of them and get the best out of everything. And this was really good learning experience.
Great. Well, thank you so much to both of you for sharing your thoughts and experiences, which is so valuable, obviously, and you can can speak with considerable authority about the program from a sort of third-party perspective. So thank you both so much to both of you for sparing the time. That's added a real extra insight to this to the session. So I'm just going to share this final slide, but this is not the end of the session, because now we are very happy to take questions, and I see there's a number of questions, some fairly chunky questions there. I just read Natalia's, and you could do a half-day session on answering her question, but these are just the kind of contact details for anyone who's interested in the program. There's QR codes there. Owen and I will put our emails in the chat, and I was going to say, if there's any questions we don't get to answer today, I'm very happy to kind of answer them sort of moving forward, just one-on-one. So but these are the details here, but I think I'm going to take this slide down now. I don't know if Corinne or Melis can share the QR codes in the chat. I'll keep it up for just 30 seconds, but should we start answering some questions? Owen, I'm going to pick.
Yeah. Shall I kick off?
Why don't you kick off? I was going to give you the most complicated, difficult ones to answer.
I think that they're all potentially complicated and difficult, aren't they? Okay. Well, look, let me just sort of start. We've got sort of three or four questions in the chat at the moment. I'll just sort of start on the first one from Beanish. Beanish, I think, again, these full answers to these questions would be quite long in trying to think about it and thinking about the sort of the detail of it. But I think a good starting point would be for you to reflect upon the different dimensions that actually you have to offer within your company. In other words, when people sort of looking at job, it's very easy just to focus on one dimension, which is the salary component. But actually, I suspect, and I've just very, very quickly had 5 seconds just looking at the front page of your website, and you clearly got, given the topic, the area that you're working in, have got some sort of potentially really interesting things that are going to enthuse people who care about the environment, who care about soil, where there's possibility of learning an enormous amount. In other words, the negotiation isn't just about salary, it's about all the things that people are going to be able to learn over an extended period of time. And if you then think about it in those types of way, there are really multiple issues that will attract people. And while it might be low on one dimension, the salary, because of the stage you're at, it could be high on many of the other dimensions. And of course, it's also got the possibility of having financial rewards further down the line. Once you expand what it is you're thinking of offering, then you get a sort of different characterization of what makes the role attractive. So that's, in the time we've got, I think that's, I'll sort of pause there on that. I'll perhaps, Paul, if you want in a moment, just come back to the emotions from Kat. Let me just sort of pick up Natalia's question, which is, as Paul said, it's a big question. I think that it's also a complicated question where there is a lot of nuance associated with it. And I'm very happy, if you want to get in touch with me, my email addresses, we'll make sure that that's supplied. I'm very happy to give you more detail and point you in the direction of some sort of excellent material on this regard. I think that there are two important things to note right off the bat. The first one is that the notion that do not get sort of into any notion that women are, worse at negotiating than men are, for example. There is no evidence for that. So women can be just as effective negotiators as men. There can be small differences in approaches. It's quite heterogeneous, people's approaches anyway, but that is there aren't differences. Where there are differences, however, relate most particularly to the difference between negotiating for oneself and negotiating on behalf of an organization. So there aren't differences, and women do at least as well when negotiating on behalf of the organization. There are, however, some barriers that women face that men don't face when negotiating on behalf of themselves. And when we can explore, you know, sort of in sort of offline, some of the deeper reasons why there are those differences when negotiating on behalf of themselves. But what it requires is for the person who's negotiating, for the woman who's negotiating, is perhaps to be aware of those and to make an adaptation in the approach. Although, quite frankly, for all men and women who are on this call and more broadly, understanding what those biases might be that people hold when negotiating with women is really important from a leadership perspective. How do I make sure that those are not detrimental in the way in which the negotiations are conducted or the opportunities that women face?
Thank you very much.
Sorry,
Suzanne, please.
I just want to add something from a female perspective on that. I remember we analyzed our negotiation styles on the program, and that for me, who was dealing also with some emotional constraints before the program, it was super helpful to have some insight on how I function in a negotiation and how to change it, actually.
Great, thank you. That kind of links into Kat's question, actually. I'll just go through a few of the questions up there. How do you keep emotions out of negotiation? I don't think you can. We're not machines. So negotiations is fundamentally a human process. So, I mean, I think emotions, if used positively, are not a bad thing in negotiations. I think you want to be as authentic as possible. But yes, things like anger don't tend to, I mean, the research shows that angry negotiators don't tend to be very good negotiators. They don't tend to share information. They sort of retreat to their biases and assumptions. So it doesn't tend to be very, very sort of productive. But what I'd suggest in terms of emotions, and this has been suggested by a number of academics, is almost try and create a kind of an emotional preparation strategy for the negotiation. So really sort of take a step back and try and acknowledge when you're feeling frustrated, when you're feeling angry, and perhaps sort of scenario plan how you might react in those different situations. So I think sort of self-awareness is really important. Another thing I would say about emotions, we do sort of cover this on the program, is trying to identify between genuine emotions, or genuine anger, for example, and tactical emotions, tactical anger. So, for example, tactical anger, if someone's using it tactically to try and get what they want in a negotiation, the worst thing you can do is get flustered and start giving things away, because obviously they will realize it's working and keep doing it. But if they're genuinely angry, then it's kind of up to you really to try and put yourself in their shoes and try and figure out why they're so angry, and then the importance of listening and questioning and just that whole kind of inquiry-based approach really comes to the fore. But yes, but emotions is a really fascinating area, and we do spend quite a long time looking at the different emotions and how you deal with them in a negotiation. There was a kind of a link to that. There was a question about the importance, Farhan, about the effective communications is essential for successful negotiations. I completely agree with that, and yes, we do cover that on the program. We have an online module on the art and science of persuasion, and during the program we focus a lot on how you can tap into emotions and those sort of what we call our system one side of our brain, in terms of sort of how we can get people to come around to our point of view. So how you frame information, how you deliver information, and things like questioning and listening. We focus a lot on that. So yeah, effective communication really important. Owen, do you want to pick another question?
Yes, absolutely. Yes. So Shivani asked what the prerequisites for the course are. The prerequisites for the course are, I guess, firstly, we do like people with a degree of experience. So, it's not for those who are completely sort of, new just out of university, for example. So we like people with some experience because, as Lee and Suzanne were talking about before, actually, it's a lot about sharing your ideas, sharing the challenges that you face, thinking about different approaches. There aren't any specific prerequisites, but you should be able to sort of bring enthusiasm, bring motivation, and bring some level of experience. You know, I think that it is best suited for people who have got probably at least sort of, you know, 6 to 8 years of experience in the workplace at a sort of a reasonable level, so that you can contribute actively. Ian asked the question about the difference between transactional and well, I guess reciprocity is what Ian has put. But I guess repeated negotiations, and clearly there is a very there is potentially a very big difference. If you've got a transactional negotiation where you're never going to meet again, then actually you will find that people often but when they're not focusing on their reputation and they're not focusing on the relationships, then it can actually be rather harder to build up some of the things that make negotiations really quite productive, including levels of trust. That said, one's always got to be slightly aware that many things that look transactional in themselves, it might be transactional with respect to this particular counterpart. That doesn't mean that actually you're not going to build your reputation up and other people are not going to know about that type of negotiation. So we've always got to be aware about sort of relationships, reputations, and so on. But you will want to play out sort of trust and value creation differently in the more interactions that you're going to have. And again, we can explore that further. Paul, I'll hand back to you, and then I'm happy to come back in.
Okay, sounds good.
Lee and Susanna, if you've got comments, do jump in.
Great, thank you. Thank you. So, Lee, did you want to?
Yeah, I was just going to say, from my perspective as somebody doing the course, it was so valuable to actually just play around with a lot of these concepts, and we were encouraged to play around with these concepts in the simulation. So, you know, I picked up on the emotion question as well, because that was my view coming onto the program, that actually emotions have nothing to do with negotiations, but I was completely wrong about that. Emotions are fairly intrinsic to negotiations, and actually, from a tactical point of view, can be used very effectively. And it's even more important for us to recognize when they're being used against us. But from the program's point of view, we actually had, won't give anything away, but we actually had at least one opportunity to practice, you know, the emotional aspects in a simulation. And that was super, super helpful. And I just don't think that you would get any opportunity to have that kind of experience outside a program like this.
Great, thank you very much, Lee. Just a couple of other questions. So David has asked the question about the challenges of negotiating via email, and yes, I mean, I think a lot of that is happening, obviously, particularly post-COVID, and virtual negotiations are definitely a challenge. They are different, that you struggle to have that ability to develop the relationship so much. It's actually sometimes a bit easier to walk away from a negotiation when it's virtual, because you can just press the kind of the leave meeting button. I think sometimes if you've got a taxi, you've gone to the airport and you've flown across to the US, you tend to kind of focus more on getting a deal. It's a sort of an easy opt-out. But I've shared an article actually, which I wrote about, you know, a few tips in terms of dealing with virtual negotiations. I mean, what I would say is some of the principles we talk about on our program are every bit as important, even more important virtually. So the importance of process and structure, and to know where the negotiation is going, and having just the parameters around it is really important. The ability to have that kind of emotional antennae to sort of sense, you know, when your counterpart is getting frustrated or tired is really, really important. And a lot of other things, you know, in relating to email and whether you should use text, and so yeah, there's lots of different elements, but it is challenging, and it's a different context, but it can be it can still be a very sort of effective platform for negotiating. There was a question from there was a question about smaller companies when you're dealing with an M&A situation from Vlada. I think one of the challenges, obviously, there seems potentially here to be a sort of power dynamic going on, where you might consider the larger companies to have all the power. I mean, what I would say is the fact that you're at the negotiating table means obviously they want something from you. There's a reason why they're there, and you have something to offer them. And I think there's a danger sometimes in negotiation where you overestimate the power of your counterpart and underestimate your own power. And if you do that, if you underestimate your own power, it does sometimes tend to be a bit of a self-fulfilling prophecy where the larger party will call all the shots and push through an agreement which might not necessarily be optimal for you. But as I said, the fact, there are ways of, via working on the stakeholders, who influences whom, how you can get your counterpart to come around to your sort of point of view, that there are ways of taking that on. I mean, you look at the climate change negotiations and some of the small countries around the world who are right at the cutting edge of climate change have actually been very effective in terms of negotiating with some of the bigger players by using by having cabinet meetings underwater and by using some of them you might consider them PR stunts, but they're actually been quite effective. So don't assume you're powerless, Vlada. Owen, any
yeah, so picking up Alicia's question here, which is about sort of it sounds like a complex multi-party negotiation that you have got, Alicia, where actually you, as you say, you've got people with different backgrounds and different cultures. I think one of the big challenges, so you're deep into that space of multi-party negotiations, and as you're deep into that space, one of the things you've got to realize is that it takes time, and often it takes different approaches when you're dealing with different groups in order to build up the relationship and the trust. And that's not something that can necessarily be rushed, because you've got to build up the credibility. You've got to make sure that they understand where you're standing, how you're engaged in this, what your interests and concerns actually are. And each of the parties needs to understand that, so that people really get what is your integrity and how are they going to relate to it. And of course, that will be different when you're dealing with some of the indigenous people, when you're dealing with certain businesses, they're going to have different sets of interests. So but they're also going to require different approaches as you engage with them. So trying to understand what is going to be appropriate for each while maintaining your authenticity. We do adopt different approaches, but that doesn't mean that we're not going to be authentic ourselves. But it takes time. But as well as that, what you're also trying to then do is to map out what those ranges of different multiple issues are. So it's multi-party, it's multi-issue, to try to sort of start thinking about what packages there are that you'll be able to create value. I think the typical mistakes that people make is that the more complex negotiations, people think they can achieve them more quickly than they can, but they do take they are fragile, and the commitments that you get from different parties themselves are often fragile, and so as you build coalitions, you've got to think about how am I going to make those more robust? How am I going to help parties work with each other? It's an incomplete answer given the time we've got, but I hope it gives sort of some ideas for you. Paul, do you want to pick one, and then I'll go for the last one, whichever one you don't pick.
Great. So let's, David, you've been very patient because I see your question was a while ago. Often my negotiations, I get befuddled by the commercial speak on occasion. How do you suggest that can be handled during the negotiation? Well, I think sort of listening and questioning and trying to sort of not get overwhelmed by the sort of the commercial speak, and really try and strip things down a bit. So I think, yeah, just try and put yourself in their shoes, trying to, I mean, ultimately they're individuals in a negotiation, and yeah, try and put yourself in their shoes, ask questions, listen, and try to sort of find out exactly where they're coming from and what the really important issues are to be negotiated. And as Owen said, when it comes to creating value, there's obviously going to be some issues which are important to them and less important to you, and vice versa. So I would encourage you to dig down, and if it's really, really technical, make sure there's someone on your team. If we're getting into really detailed tax policy or trade policy, make sure there's someone on your team to give you that necessary support to make sure you can you're not negotiating blind, so to speak. Owen.
Yeah, well, funny enough, I was going to suggest that Lee might have some observation from a legal perspective, but also I was going to say just two things. One is for negotiations, teams make a big difference, right? Teams are more effective in negotiations than individuals are, and the more effectively you can build a team which has got different capabilities, you're bringing it because you've got heterogeneous skills. You can different people are going to bring along different things to the negotiation. The second thing is, I just to say from my perspective, is it sounds a little bit as though you feel rushed and as you use the word, befuddled within the negotiation that you're engaged in. You find that you don't know quite what's going on, but you feel clearly, well, it sounds as though you feel under quite a lot of pressure in that room, and then you might be making concessions that you don't think are appropriate. When people do feel that they've got that advantage, they can try to move the process along more quickly than you feel comfortable with. If you can control the process a little bit, how long, what information is given in advance, and so on, that can complement having the effective team there as well. Lee, do you want to say anything from a legal perspective in your experience?
Well, even though I'm a lawyer, I meet lots of other lawyers who throw around technical terms in their particular area of law, which I'm not familiar with. So a lot of the time, I will just ask, can we make sure that we're on the same page about what you've just meant by that? But if you're in a situation where you think it will expose weakness to say, I don't understand that term, then I think it brings into play one of the other concepts that we learned on the program about keeping all the negotiating points in play for as long as possible. So, you have to have in your mind that actually you don't want to conclude a negotiation if you don't understand everything that's being negotiated. So finding a way to come away from that meeting and say, okay, that's a great first, second, or third meeting or whatever, taking your advice, doing your research, and then coming back in to negotiations armed with more knowledge. That was definitely, again, a concept that we learned on the program, because my tendency was to think, well, if I'm meeting somebody today to negotiate or have a meeting about something, it's got to be concluded by the end of the meeting. But actually, a lot of the time, there isn't any external time pressure. It's only internal time pressure that you're putting on yourself.
Thanks very much, Lee. And then just sort of picking up Tony's question then, there are two ways of thinking about this, I guess, on a first cut, Tony. The first one is that if somebody has got a sort of a really good BATNA, and there's one issue involved in this, then it sort of implies that there's relatively little value that would make them want to sign an agreement with you rather than with somebody else. If they're relatively indifferent between the two, then it can certainly be a tougher negotiation. However, if you take a little step back from that, there are some questions that you might well ask yourself, which is, are there actually more, they've got a good other offer, but are there areas where, I can potentially add more value to them than the other offer has got? In other words, I can make my own position look that much more attractive to them than the counterpart offer that they've already got. How can I understand what it is that they really want, what their real objectives are, what it is that matters most to them, so that I can build a package that is going to be most effective for them, but also to meet my needs. In other words, you're trying to be creative and think about additional value that you can produce if you work collaboratively solving the problem together. And if you can do that in an environment where there's a positive relationship, then that's all well and good. Because remember that actually people also like finishing a negotiation feeling good about the process and the outcome that they've got themselves. It's not just about the objective outcome, it's also about this subjective feeling. Do I feel good as a negotiator? Do I feel I've got a good agreement? Do I feel respected? Would I want to work with this person again? Those all matter a lot. In other words, as Paul Paul said earlier, you don't get rid of emotions, and emotions can be negative, but they can be positive. And if we can tap in and create positive emotions, then that can really be beneficial as well.
And the one thing I'd add to that is don't reveal that you have a weak BATNA, because they might not know that your BATNA isn't as strong as theirs. So, for example, if you're a supplier, telling a supplier that you just dumped your last partner and you're the only supplier in the market can provide the service that you as a buyer need, is going to obviously make them in a very strong position and think their BATNA is even better than it is. So I think don't assume that they know that you have perhaps a weaker BATNA than them, because they might not necessarily know that.
I have a last thought on this, on the program. By doing the simulations, of course, we didn't know about the others' positions, but we were able to make the whole negotiation frame transparent afterwards and see from where to where we could have negotiated. And this was really a value add and a gain in experience to be also more courageous. And for example, in this case, if you have a lower BATNA, to deal with it, to have this experience with the peers and see where you can go even with such a situation. So this is a very good point of the program.
Great, thank you. Thank you, Suzanne. I'm not sure to hear, I was just reading, it's quite long. I'm not sure if that was a question or more comment. Sounds fairly complex there. But yeah, I just like to hear if you'd like to you have our emails in the chat. So if you'd like to discuss more specifically online, very happy to help. But thank you very much for everyone who's stayed on the call as well. Over an hour now, and still got 165 people on. So thank you very much for your for your support and involvement today. And as I said, we have our details if you'd like to get in touch with me and Owen direct. And these are the details about the program. But thank you very much. It's been fun. It's been great to participate today.
Thank you all.